Hi, welcome to Talking Sunday Readings. My name is Ann Carter. I am here as usual with Pastor Richard Stadler and with Tim Carter. We are talking about the lectionary readings that have been assigned for the fourth Sunday after Pentecost. They are from the book of Samuel, a very long reading. First Samuel, a long reading about the famous battle between the giant Goliath and the shepherd David. The second reading is the epistle lesson from 2 Corinthians chapter 6, and the gospel for today is from Mark 4.
Reading from 1 Samuel. Now the Philistines gathered their forces for war, and assembled at Soko in Judah. They pitched camp at Ephes Dammim, between Soko and Azekah. The champion named Goliath, who was from Gath, came out of the Philistine camp. His height was 6 cubits and a span. He had a bronze helmet on his head, and wore a coat of scale armor of bronze weighing 5,000 shekels. On his legs he wore bronze greaves, and a bronze javelin was slung on his back. His spear shaft was like a weaver's rod, and its iron point weighed 600 shekels. His shield-bearer went ahead of him. Goliath stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why do you come out and line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine? And are you not the servants of Saul? Choose a man and have him come down to me. If he is able to fight and kill me, we will become your subjects. But if I overcome him and kill him, you will become our subjects and serve us." Then the Philistine said, "This day I defy the armies of Israel. Give me a man and let us fight each other." On hearing the Philistines' words, Saul and all the Israelites were dismayed and terrified. Early in the morning, David left the flock in the care of a shepherd, loaded up and set out as Jesse had directed. He reached the camp as the army was going out to its battle positions, shouting the war cry. Israel and the Philistines were drawing up their lines facing each other. David left his things with the keeper of supplies, ran to the battle lines and asked his brothers how they were. As he was talking to them, Goliath, the Philistine champion from Gath, stepped out from his lines and shouted his usual defiance, and David heard it. David said to Saul, "Let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine. Your servant will go and fight him." Saul replied, "You are not able to go out against this Philistine and fight him. You are only a young man, and he has been a warrior from his youth." But David said to Saul, "Your servant has been keeping his father's sheep. When a lion or a bear came and carried off a sheep from the flock, I went after it, struck it, and rescued the sheep from its mouth. When it turned on me, I seized it by its hair, struck it, and killed it. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, because he has defied the armies of the living God. The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will rescue me from the hand of this Philistine." Saul said to David, "Go, and the Lord be with you." Then Saul dressed David in his own tunic. He put a coat of armor on him and a bronze helmet on his head. David fastened on his sword over the tunic and tried walking around because he was not used to them. "I cannot go in these," he said to Saul, "because I am not used to them." So he took them off. Then he took his staff in his hand, chose 5 smooth stones from the stream, put them in the pouch of his shepherd's bag, and, with his sling in hand, approached the Philistine. Meanwhile the Philistine, with his shield-bearer in front of him, kept coming closer to David. He looked David over and saw that he was little more than a boy, glowing with health and handsome, and he despised him. He said to David, "Am I a dog that you come at me with sticks?" And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. Come here, he said, and I'll give your flesh to the birds and the wild animals. David said to the Philistine, You come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I'll strike you down and cut off your head. This very day I will give the carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds and the wild animals, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. All those gathered here will know that it is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands. As the Philistine moved closer to attack him, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet him. Reaching into his bag and taking out a stone, he slung it and struck the Philistine on the forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell face down on the ground.
Just a little bit of background on this just marvelous story of David and Goliath, which has been told to children and told over and over again to adults for centuries. It is the big guy versus the little guy, which has been referred to in a lot of businesses. It's been the epitome of right conquering wrong. It's a very interesting story, though, of God preparing somebody for a massive battle, truly, of preparation in odd ways, I think, that you wouldn't understand, that one day God's going to say, I taught you how to do this, now I want you to step up and do it. David was a shepherd. He was the youngest of 6 brothers. He lived in Bethlehem. This is before David was king. A couple of Sundays ago, we read how Israel wanted a king. God gave them the king Saul. Saul did not live up to expectations, and God had Samuel anoint a new king. So David has been anointed, and he is waiting before, while Saul is still on the throne, he is in waiting to take over and to lead God's people. Goliath is a Philistine, and he engages the Philistines, and the Israelites were at each other for many, many years. And it's an interesting battle tactic that I think we'll talk about. Goliath was huge. Goliath challenged. David came out and met the challenge, and it was a very unorthodox manner of fighting. Goliath was armed to the teeth. David had a slingshot and stones, and David won. And he will say, the first to say, that it wasn't him who won, it was God working through him that won the battle. So with that little background prep, Tim, I will turn it over to you as always for questions and comments that you have, because you always have great questions and comments.
Oh, well, thank you. So as I was reading this, one thing really stood out to me. It's a long reading, and there's a very long description about what Goliath was wearing. They really go into detail about the armor that he had on. And part of it is just how big it was. Clearly he was a big guy and he was wearing big armor, but they really go into detail about all the little things he was wearing. He had, pieces of armor here and on his legs and this and that and the other thing. And I was wondering why did they include all these details? Why go into such lengths to describe what Goliath had on? Was his armor weird or unique, or was it just to illustrate how big and imposing he was? Or what kind of purpose would that have served? Because in this very long reading, do we really need to know, everything that Goliath had on? Yeah.
Do we need to know all of that? Well, I'll offer a comment first and then turn it over to Dick. When I've read the book of Judges, I have been kind of surprised a little bit about how there will be great detail about Gideon. There will be great detail about Deborah. And then we have this other judge and he killed this guy and let's move on. It seems to me that some of these are eyewitness accounts, that there was somebody at the battle who was really impressed with Goliath and how big he was and what he was wearing. That's one take on it. And we know the descriptions, and I had to go in and figure out how long, big is a cubit, what is the span, how much does a shekel weigh. A cubit was 18 inches, which means that Goliath was almost 10 feet tall. That's very imposing. All of his armor weighed about 125 pounds. The spear's head weighed 600 shekels of iron, which was about 15 pounds. So again, I don't know if this, like, I imagine this is somebody who was there and was really impressed and wanted then to show this guy, he was formidable. He was impregnable. Nobody's going to beat this guy. And yet David did. And how did David do it? God helped him. That's my impression. Dick?
I just recently read happily a scholarly article about this chapter. And this particular scholar was pointing out that there are very few giants in human history. And he counted about 5, I think, that were over 8 feet tall. But all of them shared a similar disease. And the symptoms of that disease are poor eyesight, and a certain amount of a lack of balance and so forth. And so if Goliath comes out, let's say he is 9 feet tall, according to and that's my estimate too, plus, that would be an imposing thing if he was all covered with this armor. I mean, and he's expecting one-on-one, hand-to-hand combat because he can't see at a distance. So he can't use a bow and arrow. He can't use a sling, okay? And so if that is true, and I've got to test it because it just ran across this article, but that really helps me understand what's going on here. Maybe the fact that David was coming at him with a sling, according to this author, you can get up to 200 miles an hour with a sling, with the projectile that you toss with it by using centrifugal force, and you let go of one end of it and it goes. So this is the artillery of the ancient world. And if you look in the Bible, the Benjaminites were left-handed and they could sling a stone at a hair and not miss. They were amazingly accurate with their sling. It was like the ancient field artillery. And so David would not have to get close to him and do any hand-to-hand combat. And I'm sure all of the rest of the soldiers of Israel were looking at this and saying, nowhere, I don't want to get close to that guy. Yeah, because no matter how strong I am, I can't penetrate all that armor that he's got on. It's so heavy. And quite frankly, Goliath doesn't have to worry about it either, because his spear, if it's 15 pounds just on the tip, would go through all of their armor if he's that strong. And so the question that this author raised was, who was really the underdog? We always assume David is the portrayal of the underdog. He said, just the opposite. David was coming in there at a strategic advantage to take on Goliath. But then I thought, scripturally, who was on his side? God was fighting the battle for him. So really, David wasn't the underdog in this battle. We've always portrayed him that way, and we've let the world portray him that way. And it's a useful metaphor. But if you take seriously that God was using him as his warrior, then nobody can take on God. Nobody can beat God. And so Goliath isn't the overwhelming threat that Israel had assumed. Here's another question. Where was King Saul during this whole thing?
He was in his tent.
He was on the battlefield. He heard those challenges. And we're told that Saul was a head taller than anybody else. So he was an imposing figure among the Israelites. But he comes nothing close to Goliath. But he also is not willing to go out and take him on as maybe the tallest Israeli in the whole army. And so when David is sent to him, the word comes that David, was challenging why people weren't going defending the name of God. He puts his armor on David because he's right there in a tent somewhere in the bivouac with the rest of the troops. So this is not a very positive picture of King Saul and his courage, and maybe that's why this is put in here to remind us that sometimes when we assume that we're the underdog in certain situations, if God is our God and the Lord is our Lord, maybe we're not so much the underdog, and that we will not only survive, but we will do very well because he is there fighting our battles for us. You know? And so I think this has a powerful lesson for us to not judge things by appearance. It's kind of what last week we saw in the epistle lesson. We live by faith, not by sight. And the Israelites were going by sight more than by faith. David was living by faith, not by sight. It didn't scare the bejeebers out of him that Goliath was this big, because he knew what he had done. He had killed wolves, he had killed bears, and that's what he tells King Saul. It's kind of a neat lesson. And I think we'll see the faith of David being urged upon the disciples of Jesus when we get to the gospel lesson, because they will be challenged to remember, hey, trust me, I'm not going to let something bad happen to you. David was convinced of that God would not let him be defeated and that God would win. And he gives all the credit to God. He doesn't say anything about his slinging ability or anything like that. It's kind of neat.
Yeah. But at the same time, I think that David was a pragmatist. I think because he tells Saul, I can do this. God has prepared me for this. I've killed lions. I've killed bears. I know that I can do this. So don't doubt me because God trained me. God is on my side. Don't look at outward appearance. I know what's really going on, and this is all for his glory. And it takes a special sight to be able to see that, to know that God has trained you in a way that he is going to use you, and now it's the time. And then you just have to step into the challenge and not be afraid. Not be afraid. Tim, was there what else? What other ideas, comments?
On this one, the way this whole situation is described is odd to me. The picture that is painted in the reading is that both armies are all lined up and ready to go, and then Goliath comes out and challenges everybody. And the way it sounds like he just stood there till the end of the day, and then they all went back to their tents. And the next day they all lined up again. Goliath came out again and challenged everybody. And when nobody came forward, they all just stood there and waited for the next day. And I was just wondering, is that really what they did back then? Is that how these kind of things went? What's to stop either army from just charging forward and doing battle? I guess if Goliath was, maybe that he was that scary that nobody even wanted to try to fight around him. But it seems very strange, a very strange way to run a battle or to fight.
Well, as I picture the battle scene, there's the Valley of Elah between two hills, and the Philistines are on one hill and the Israelites are on another hill. So they're not going to come down into the valley unless they're ready to do battle. Okay. And because you don't want to sacrifice the high ground. Right. And the Philistines would be stupid to attack them on their high ground, and the Israelites would be stupid to run across the Valley of Elah and attack the Philistines on high ground. And so I don't picture them coming down to the Valley of Elah to listen to what he's saying. I think they're cowering in fear up on their hill refuge and listening to him. And somehow he's able to project so they could hear him. And so that's why David, says, how come nobody's going out now? And I think that's maybe an implied indication that they weren't going out, that they were kind of holding back under the protection of their hill and the trees that were on it and the cover. So that's how I picture the scene. I'm not a military expert. I should ask my brother, who's a retired general, about whether that was a good picture of the two armies.
Well, I asked the military person in my house about this battle, and his first comment was, well, it's cheaper to have two champions fight each other. It's cheaper than cheaper to do that than you don't lose your entire army. And then he looked up and he said that there is no proof that there was champion versus champion fighting. There's in myth, there's some stories in in legend. Certainly the story of the Iliad of Hector and Achilles going after each other, that's a champion versus a champion. So there's anecdotal evidence that there was this practice that went on, but there's no other historical record that this is how battles were fought. But it was certainly, like I say, cheaper. And if your army was conscripted and you've got a bunch of farmers and you've got sheep herders and you've got they've got no experience and they've got no weaponry and they've got no tactical knowledge, it's better to keep them safe up on the hill than to send them down to get slaughtered. That's my 2 cents on that.
Yeah, I don't know if we know the composition of each army, or how well equipped and how much armor they had and so forth. But I think if you go back to the basics of the text, that we know what David had, and he had long range artillery. And so he did not have to come close to the threat in order to put the threat down on the ground. And he used that. So, and the Lord is the one who guided it all. So, yeah.
Yeah. Well, we've taken a lot of time with that. So moving into, I know, Dick, you have some pictures that you would like to share with us on the gospel story, and I don't want us to get too long, so I'm going to turn this over to you a little bit.
The Holy Gospel according to Mark. That day when evening came, he said to his disciples, "Let us go over to the other side." Leaving the crowd behind, they took him along just as he was, in the boat. There were also other boats with him. A furious squall came up, and the waves broke over the boat so that it was nearly swamped. Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. The disciples woke him and said to him, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" He got up, rebuked the wind, and said to the waves, "Be quiet, be still." Then the wind died down, and it was completely calm. He said to his disciples, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" They were terrified and asked each other, "Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him."
Okay, then let me see if I can share this with you. And get the slideshow up there. The story takes place in the Sea of Galilee area, and the starting point seems to be Capernaum. And from Capernaum, Jesus says, "Let's go to the other side of the lake." And the story after this story is his healing of a demoniac who is in the land of the Gerasenes. So that'd be over here on the east side of the Sea of Galilee. Now, what's interesting is that in 1986, 2 fishermen found a boat that was buried in the mud for 2,000 years. And the reason they could find it is because they had 4 years of drought, and the waters of the Sea of Galilee had kept going down, down, down. And in a fantastic effort, they salvaged it, and it's now on display in a museum in Gennesaret. And they were able to build a model of a boat based on what they found. And so if this is the boat similar to the size that Jesus and his disciples were on that night during the storm, and the back part of it has this kind of flattened area where Jesus could have put down a cushion and fallen asleep. And the rest of the disciples would be up ahead of him, rowing and getting the boat over to the other side of the Sea of Galilee. Now, if you look at the geography, on the western side of the Sea of Galilee, the opposite of where they're heading, which is going to be behind them, there's the Arbel Cliffs. And on calm seas, it's just wonderful. It's beautiful. But that Arbel Cliff, together with the mountains on the other side, create a wind tunnel. And the wind that comes in the evening from the Mediterranean comes whipping through that and can create a stormy sea in just a matter of minutes. And I've experienced that when I've been on the Sea of Galilee. We started out on our boat ride with calm water, and before we knew it, we had 4-foot high waves. This may be what happened to them. So they leave from the western side of the Sea of Galilee, they're heading to the eastern side, and they got this ferocious storm. And the width of the Sea of Galilee here at its widest point is 3.5 miles. So we're only talking a couple miles that they had to traverse in order to get to the other side. But during that time, a storm came up, and it was so vicious that professional fishermen were scared, which you figure you usually fish at night. So they must have been used to storms coming up at night. But this one was of a sort that even professional fishermen were scared. Yeah. So those are my pictures. Any questions before I stop sharing? Okay, let me get rid of that.
Interesting. I guess I've got a question then about that. They describe a storm. Would it have, I'm picturing rain and winds and thunder and lightning, but would this have been more just a storm of the water and the waves getting wild and choppy?
I don't see any reference to the lightning or the thunderstorms. When we were out there and we experienced it, it was just wind. That was all there was. There was no lightning. There was no rain. There was no storm clouds. It was just this wind tunnel just shooting the wind right across the northern part of the Sea of Galilee.
Well, that changes the picture I've always had, and I think changes a lot of the artist renditions I've seen.
Well, a lot of the movies that you see in artist renditions show now it could have been, and the guy Mark may just not have mentioned it, but it wouldn't necessarily have to be. We know from the topography. Yeah.
My question also then is, if it's a storm like that, or of any kind of storm, how did Jesus sleep through this? Why did it take the disciples to wake him up? Was it just because he was unafraid, or what happened there? What was going on? He was just
if he's the Son of God, and from time to time during his humiliation, he chooses to use some of his divine powers. He could have been sleeping, but fully aware of how he was going to use that episode in order to teach his disciples something. So he would certainly know the storm was going on, I'm guessing. And that therefore, when he calms the storm, we see the evidence that they are amazed and they learn something new about him that they had not known. So this had to be very early in their ministry. But the question I have that's a kind of a companion with yours is, how many miracles have they already seen? Have they already seen the changing of the water into wine at Cana? And have they, when you put these different gospels together, it's kind of hard to coordinate the sequence of events precisely. But they still hadn't learned enough. They're on the front edge of their learning cycle. And so it's going to take 3 years for them to get all the information they need about Jesus in order to put it all together after Pentecost. I think that's an interesting detail that they still haven't caught on. And Jesus says, "Oh, you of little faith, do you still not have faith?" And after the miracle of the water into wine, it says the disciples believed in him because of that miracle. Well, what kind of faith was it? It was still uninformed. It wasn't fully formed, and they needed more input from the Holy Spirit and from the experiences with Jesus for that faith to grow to a point where it would be stable. I don't know. Anne, you have something you want to throw in there?
Well, I just thought it was interesting that we have a couple of experiences like this, or the disciples do. And this one, Jesus was on the boat with them. The next one, Jesus is not. And it's almost like training. I'm with you and I'll protect you. The next time, oh, we forgot, he's not here, so we're going to die. But he walks to them across the water. And eventually Jesus is gone, and he doesn't come like that, but he is still with them. So it's as though it's a bits and pieces of instruction building on a platform of, this is who Jesus is. He will always be here with me, taking care of me, because I had this experience before, and I know that he's not going to leave me. And
isn't that the way faith life is formed?
Yes.
That each event that we get through by God's grace informs our faith. It gives it depth. It gives it insight that we didn't have before that episode happened, that we thought was going to be the end of our lives, you know, and so forth. But we get through it by God's grace. And then we look back and say, oh, yeah, now I see. And so I think we're at the front end of this learning cycle for the disciples. And they finally discover something new. Even the wind and the sea obey him. Oh, okay. He can turn water into wine. That's something they had already learned in Cana. And each episode is going to keep adding more grist for their mills and more information for the formation of their faith. And I think that's a good reminder to us too. We do this with children all the time, don't we? We give them certain episodes, we give them certain challenges, we stand back and let them lose a game. We let them maybe experience a bad event in order for them to learn the realities of life and learn some lessons from it. And I think Jesus does that with his disciples all the time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, with that, I thank you for joining us. We had some great discussions, kind of long discussions, but I hope that they were beneficial. I hope that you like us, share us, and come back next time.